Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Corwin Monday afternoon webinar series, your no-cost platform for superior professional learning. Today's webinar is Student-Centered Assessment, Strengthening Student Ownership Through Impact Teams, presented by Paul Bloomberg and Barb Pitchford. Now I'd like to turn the meeting over to Charlene Maher, Senior Marketing Manager for Corwin, to introduce our presenters. Charlene?
Hi, thanks so much, Jeff. And welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon or early evening, depending on which coast you're on. I'd like to welcome Paul Bloomberg and Barb Pitchford as our presenters today. Paul Bloomberg is a national consultant and the founder and chief learning officer for the CORE Collaborative, a professional learning network that specializes in student-centered approaches to learning. He is a former principal and instructional leader who has directly supported multiple successful school turnaround and school innovation efforts nationally. Barb Pitchford is a national consultant focusing on leadership for school improvement. She is executive director of professional learning and co-founder of the CORE Collaborative. During her 30-plus years in public education, Barb has worked at all school levels, high school, middle school, and elementary, as a teacher, counselor, and administrator. Together, they are the authors of Leading Impact Teams, Building a Culture of Efficacy, published by Corwin. They are the developers of the Impact Teams model, an evidence-based model for teacher teams and PLCs to embed formative assessment into the classroom and build student ownership of learning. So please join me in welcoming Paul and Barb to today's webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Paul Bloomberg.
Good afternoon. It's Barb Pitchford.
And we just wanted to get started by letting you know our hashtag and also a little bit of information around a Canvas course. So you'll see at the top of your screen how to enroll in our Canvas course, which houses a lot of great resources all aligned to the Impact Team model. Charlene will also be sending out an email blast to everyone that signed up with this link. Our Twitter handles are here on the screen, and our hashtag is on the lower left-hand corner. I'm going to turn this over to Barb.
So good morning, good afternoon. I'm sorry, I'm actually in Hawaii, working with schools here, so I'm a little bit discombobulated in terms of time. But let's start off with the book itself. If you take a look at the book, it's really, and let's unpack the title. This is to give you kind of a 30,000-foot perspective. It's not just impact teams, the nouns. Note the verb, leading impact teams. It's about collaborative leadership, that is, developing leadership capacity within the school to lead effective teams that result in collective action. Below the title is the byline, which is actually more important than the title, and the byline is building a culture of efficacy. So we know that efficacy is a belief for students, a belief in themselves as learners, for teachers, a belief in their ability to make a difference, and the collective, a belief in the ability to positively impact students' lives. So we know the four sources of efficacy, that is safety, feedback, models of success, and mastery moments. And student-centered assessment accesses all four sources. So the impact team model is all about creating the conditions to strengthen efficacy school-wide.
So we're going to move on to set you up for a video because we thought that the best way to get an idea as to what Impact Teams really is to take a look at some kids in action involved in the student-centered assessment protocol that we'll be unpacking today with you. So you can have a piece of paper handy on the left-hand side. You can jot down some strengths that you're noticing from the student. And on the right-hand side, we're going to unpack the inferences that we can have. What are some things that we are noticing that probably the teachers did in the classroom to empower kids to take ownership of their learning? And the first video that we're going to take a look at actually comes from Naples Street Elementary School in Staten Island, New York. And this is actually a video of two first graders engaged in a glow and grow strategy that supports our classroom protocol to put kids in charge of their learning.
Everyone gets mixed up.
Lara, what are you doing?
I'm checking my paint my I can read like a movie star in yellow because Carlos said I need to pay attention to punctuation more.
Okay.
And I read like a movie star by scooping up my words. And I could show you later. I got it, Josh yelled as he raced across Dink's backyard. I leaped into the air and missed the volleyball and fell in a heap. Dink laughed. You got it all right. Way to go, Nate, Ruth's voice cried. She gave it 4-year-old brother Nate a high five. You just scored us another point. Nate blushed and smiled shyly at his big sister.
A glow for you is that I like how you scooped up more than one word at a time, but a grow for you is to notice how the character is feeling and make your voice match a little more.
Okay. So I could check me on yellow.
Lara, can you explain why you think that's a grow for him?
Because it just sounds like everyone has the same voice.
What do you think about that?
I think about that good because I think I only gave a voice for these. You got it all right. I only had a voice for that.
Okay, so when do you try out the grow that your partner gave you?
So we try it out next reading time. So I got notice how the character's feeling and make your voice match because I only did it once. And you do it, and I gave her punctuation. So she next reading time has to pay more attention to punctuation, and I have to pay and I have to notice how the character is feeling and make her voice match.
Can you guys explain to me how using this success criteria has helped you with your reading?
It helped me with my reading because when I paid attention to punctuation and I reread to sound like a movie star and I noticed how the character is feeling and make your voice match a little in another book. That's how I noticed it. That's almost the only way we notice it.
It's helped me to scoop up more than one word at a time, notice how the character is feeling, and make my voice match, and we read to sound like a movie star.
And what does it mean to read like a movie star?
And reads like you scoop. Well, this is like reread to sound like movie stars, so you reread the page or book. And paying attention to punctuation is really how you usually read like a movie star.
So Barb, you want to dig into the things that we noticed about the students in terms of strengths?
I do. So here's what we saw. Take a look at your list and compare it to ours. But what we saw was the ability for them to both give and receive feedback, to have the feedback specific to the success criteria. If you notice, they were referencing their success criteria checklist. They obviously have spent a lot of time with understanding why the success criteria connects to reading fluency. They've had to practice a ton with using the success criteria to move the learning forward, and they're applying it to authentic reading. So what we think about is we say, that's great, that's amazing, we'd love to see that in the classroom, but what did the teacher do to create the conditions for that to happen?
And I'll share some of those. So obviously the teachers co-constructed the success criteria regarding point of view and perspective and fluency. The teacher led the kids through a lot of guided practice with feedback. There's obviously a deep understanding of the standards and how they all work together. And so teachers have been engaged in the Unpacking for Success protocol and creating rubrics and checklists and scoring guides as a result of that. There's been a lot of explicit modeling of the standard and also modeling on how to give and receive feedback using the Glow and Grow strategy. Were there any more inferences that you noted, Barb?
Well, I think also the kids seem very, very comfortable with actually the feedback itself. Instead of being hesitant to share mistakes or weaknesses, Carlos was very comfortable saying, oh yeah, this is what I need to do. It wasn't evaluative. It promoted the learning rather than stopped the learning.
So I'm going to shoot this over to Barb, and she's going to lay out the learning intentions for today.
So for our webinar today, we all want our students to be totally engaged in their own learning, to be able to self and peer assess. And so what we're going to do is explore what we call our EAA, which stands for Evidence, Analysis, and Action, Classroom/Student Protocol, and how it's related to the student-centered assessment process. We're going to learn the 4 phases of self and peer assessment.
And the first thing that we're going to dig into is the what, and just clarifying what we're all about. And we do have a classroom protocol that Barb is going to unpack. But if you think about the 1800s, when we were thinking about train travel, that the engineer and the conductor were in charge of everything. They were in charge of when the train stopped, where it stopped, and where it was going, and what and it had some aligned places that you could travel. But what we're really trying to dig into with student-centered assessment is we know that there's a variety of directions that kids can go, and student-centered assessment really creates like a GPS monitoring system when feedback comes into the learner, whether feedback is from the teacher, feedback is from self, or feedback is from their friends. The feedback really helps the learner to go on a learning journey.
So when we talk about, let me just clarify some language around this. So student-centered assessment is basically the formative assessment process in its holistic sense. But when we unpack the formative assessment process, there's basically 5 core practices of that. Actually, one of the resources we like to use a lot is the Department of Education in the state of Iowa did a lit review of the research on assessment for learning. And they identified, and it's pretty consistent across all the research, the 5 core practices of the formative assessment process. The first one are learning progressions. So learning progressions are vertical progressions that are the pathway along which students learn to make progress. It's the knowledge and skills that are required for students to reach the learning goal. For example, in our Common Core State Standards, if you take any of the standards, let's take Reading Standard 2, the learning progression is what that standard looks like at grade 2 or grade 7, grade 8, grade 10. So it's a vertical progression of increasing complexity over time. And in the formative assessment process, it's critical that we address the progressions, because as we all know, if you're a 3rd grade teacher, not all your kids are at the 3rd grade level. Some are 1 or 2 grade levels below or more. Some are a couple of grade levels above. So the progression means that we stick with the same standard, but we look at that level of increasing complexity and provide opportunities for students to enter into that learning intention, learning goal at the place where they are. The second core practice are learning intentions and success criteria, and that's what we commonly know as unpacking the standards. So the learning intention is the target, and that's actually the first step in the assessment process. We want to have a worthy target that has value, and the learning intention in our world of state standards is basically one of the anchor standards, and we unpack that to get to the success criteria, which are the criteria, just what it says, It's the criteria that we use as indicators of progress that moves the student towards the learning target, that closes the gap. And that's what we give to students so that they understand that the ultimate goal or the learning intention is the target, but the success criteria are the pathway or the roadmap. It's how you get there. The third core practice is effective evidence-based feedback. Now, as we all know, feedback's gotten a lot of press lately, doubles the rate of learning, but not all feedback is created equal. So what we're looking at is that feedback that's quality, that's descriptive, and that's essentially based on the success criteria. You heard Laura and Carlos use their success criteria, use the success criteria for reading fluency to move Carlos forward in his reading. And by the way, feedback comes from, as Paul mentioned earlier, multiple sources. Feedback isn't just from the teacher to the student. Feedback can be from the student to themselves, student to student, teacher to student, and actually Hattie's identified feedback from the student to the learner as the most powerful feedback in the literature. And the fourth core practice is self and peer assessment. So Laura and Carlos in our video today were a perfect example of both self and peer assessment. But in self-assessment, this is when the student takes an active role in monitoring and regulating their learning. When that happens, learning dramatically increases because there's self-regulation involved, there's metacognition, but they're using the success criteria for feedback to themselves to move closer to the learning target. And then peer assessment or peer review is when we use peers as resources for learning of each other. So, and they also learn to give, not just to give feedback, but also to receive it. And of course, the student-teacher partnership is the foundation of all of this. Without the students feeling safe in the classroom, understanding that learning has a lot of errors and misconceptions, that relational trust that teacher builds with the students in their classroom, none of this can happen well. So we work very closely in the formative assessment process on creating a classroom culture that's based on relational trust. The EAA classroom protocol, as we mentioned earlier, is a student protocol. So this is how we operationalize the formative assessment process in the classroom. And the ultimate goal is to develop assessment-capable learners. It increases dramatically teacher clarity around the learning intention and the success criteria. And as you saw in the video, it expands the classroom discussion around the success criteria to move the learner. And ultimately, it strengthens the belief in the student to see themselves as learner and to develop those dispositions around learning. So as we mentioned, we have several protocols. We actually have 9. We're working on number 10. All of our protocols in the impact team model are based on our foundational protocol, which is evidence, analysis, and action. So no matter what the protocol is, whether it's micro teaching or evidence walks or team meetings, it's always what's the evidence, why are we getting it, and what action do we take next. The classroom protocol that you're seeing on your screen right now, the students use to self and peer assess. So you can see it's broken into those 3 steps, evidence, analysis, and action. And this is basically our success criteria around that student protocol.
If you notice the evidence section of the protocol, that's just making sure that the learning intentions are really clear to the kids, and it's really about pushing for high quality work. So the evidence could be a strategy or it could be a product or performance. The analysis section of our classroom protocol we're going to dig into today with the 4 phases of self and peer review, and we're going to even dibble a little bit with the action step. The big whys behind digging into student-centered in the classroom is there's tons of benefits, not only in terms of increasing learning, but lots of other benefits that occur as a result of engaging kids in the assessment process. So obviously, it develops metacognitive skills. It increases students' responsibility for the learning intention. It actually reduces achievement gaps. It develops and refines critical thinking for kids. It obviously, from the video that you saw already, increases students' ability to solve problems. It reduces disruptive behavior. It supports self-regulation. And it really strengthens executive functioning, or the ability for kids to manage their own learning. And so executive functioning is, the way they manage their time, the way they manage their paperwork, the way that they, are regulating the impulses they have regarding behavior and learning. And Barb's going to dig into some of the visible learning effects as well.
So much of our work, the impact team model, is based on John Hattie's research from the visible learning work that he's done and he published in 2009. And the research is massive and incontrovertible. So what we have done, because we've been in the field for years working with teams in the formative assessment process, is the impact team model basically operationalizes the high impact influences, and some of the influences that are embedded in the impact team model you see on your screen. So we're leveraging these influences when we get kids to take ownership of their learning. And for those of you unfamiliar with it, 0.40, the effect size on the right, where it says 0.53, 0.72, 0.40 is a hinge point. That means that you get about a year's growth in a year's time. So we've addressed several of these influences already, and of course, the bottom one, assessment-capable learner, is student-centered assessment, basically. And that's when students can answer those 3 feedback questions. They know where they're going, they know where they are in the process, and they know what they need to learn next. A particular note is teacher clarity, because students really can't begin to own their learning unless the teachers have developed a clear learning path, that is, shared the learning intentions and its relevance and value, and co-constructed the success criteria needed to get there. Basically, it's the roadmap that gets them from where they are to their learning goal. So we love this. Rick Stiggins, who is one of the gurus of the formative assessment process and assessment for learning, basically says, and we agree, students can hit any target they know about and that stands still. Our job is to get really, really clear about the target and the criteria needed to reach the goal.
So this is just a quick check-in, and we'll just kind of summarize the learning so far. So what connections can you make between the 5 core formative practices and the EAA classroom protocol? What connections can you make, Barb?
Well, it seems to me that when you look at the EAA classroom protocol, and it talks about learning progressions and learning intentions and success criteria, then that's step 1 of the evidence. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, and when you dig into the analysis section, which is the part that we're going to unpack today, it's when kids are really analyzing their work with peers and with their teacher to get relevant feedback so they can revise and take goals and set goals.
And of course, the action piece is the students actually, after the analysis, as Paul said, is saying, do I need to revise? Do I need to set a new goal? It's that empowerment, that third part of what do I need to learn next, that really amplifies and increases the learning dramatically.
So we have a Twitter challenge for those of you that follow us on Twitter. And our hashtag is Impact Teams. And the first 5 tweets that we get, we will be sending you an Impact Teams t-shirt. So the question is easy, but what is the effect size of developing assessment-capable learners? And we'll be checking on TweetDeck, the top few people that tweet out. Make sure to use the hashtag Impact Teams. And that will set us up for the how part of unpacking the classroom protocol.
So we've been talking to you about exactly what student-centered assessment means, how it's related to the formative assessment process. We've talked to you about why. Why is it so critically important, both the research and the practice? Now let's get to the good stuff, and that is how to create the conditions for students to take ownership. That is, student-centered assessment. So when you look at the 4 stages, we're going to introduce you to the 4 steps or 4 stages of developing student-centered assessment. The first one being defining the criteria. We've talked about co-constructing it, unpacking the learning intention to develop the success criteria, engaging the students in that process. We'll talk about modeling, how you model the process of using the success criteria to self and peer assess. We're going to talk to you about the critical component of improving the quality of feedback in the classroom, which means giving feedback on the quality of feedback, and then ultimately setting and revising learning goals.
So the first step is defining the criteria, and I'm going to toss this to Barb to go over some example success criteria for a summary.
So the first stage is the teachers partnering with the student to define the criteria around a process, a product, or a performance. And it's important that they first, as we talked about, unpacking it so that they have agreement. The teacher team, the impact team, has an agreement on what is actually inside of that learning target or intention. It's a deep dive into the standards, not just to get clarity, but also to calibrate the expectations. Because when the teachers sit around and take a look at the learning target, it might seem fairly straightforward, but when you actually take a deeper dive in, you will see some nuances and differing expectations. So it's not just developing the success criteria, but it's a calibration of the expectations. And then once the team has unpacked the standard and developed the success criteria, then they talk about ways to get the kids engaged and to co-construct the success criteria with the students, using examples and non-examples and models, using student voice to ensure that it's student-friendly. So what you see before you is an example of the success criteria for summarizing. Note that each criteria has a way for students to interact with it, for students to determine where they are. That metacognitive process of looking at your own work and analyzing it and saying, I need help, I can learn with a friend, or I've got it. So a reminder from this situation that the formative assessment, it is not an event, it is not a test, it is not a product. It's an ongoing process that allows students to continually determine where they are in relation to the learning intention, and then to determine next learning steps to build their sense of confidence and to take ownership, to move them towards the learning goal, to close the gap from where they are to where they go next.
And keep in mind that during the Unpacking for Success protocol, when teacher teams are unpacking the standards, they're discussing relevant products and performances that live in the real world that address the standards. So then success criteria is attached to those real world products and performances. It's really important that kids are co-constructing, even at the early age, what makes a successful summary. If we're engaging in partner talk that day, well, what would make an effective discussion between our partner? So all of this criteria, although it's unpacked with the teacher team, we always involve the students in co-construction so they have a sense of ownership of the criteria. And we can revise and refine the criteria as we go. We can scaffold the success criteria for different learners. We can take criteria away, and we can add some depending on what each student needs. So we're going to dig into actually an example of this, and we'll be watching Michelle Harbin. She's from Lyons Township High School, and she is, the kids have already co-constructed the success criteria for an extended response item that they did on a quiz regarding collision theory. And the kids didn't do the kind of job that the teacher wished that they would have done. And so at this point, Michelle will be engaging the kids in defining the criteria again, because this learning is very important.
So what you're looking for is the way this checklist could be applied to the example at the top of the page.
So you're going to use your pink highlighter. When you use your pink highlighter on that example at the top of the page, what you're highlighting is anything that's a definition or part of collision theory. Okay. When you use your yellow highlighter, you're going to highlight the factor that's mentioned in that example, the factor that affects reaction rate. And your blue highlighter is the explanation in terms of collision theory. Okay, so there's an example at the top. That's where you're highlighting the words. So in each example that you look at, you're probably only going to be looking at one factor at a time. So there might only be a little bit of yellow in your highlighted part because probably just looking at one factor at a time. So what you have at the top of the page is actually a pretty thorough example. If you can find all three colors that you highlighted, then all parts of our checklist are involved in that explanation.
Boom.
Okay. Now I'm going to show you something I wrote. Okay. You don't have to write anything down for this, but you can tell me what I need to work on. Okay.
Now
I wrote an answer to the question. I'm scrolling down to find it. Oops, I missed it. All right. Here's what I wrote. You guys can let me have it. It's okay. But just tell me what colors I would use for this. Here's my answer to the question. Temperature can change the reaction rate. Molecules have to collide to react, so temperature makes it happen.
Yellow.
Okay, so you said yellow, Megan. What should I highlight in yellow?
Temperature.
Okay. Because that's the factor, right? Okay, thanks. I'll even highlight it twice.
Whoa.
Okay. All right. Is there anything I can highlight in pink? What is pink about?
Collide.
Yeah,
the
collide
collision
to
theory,
react.
but
Collide
you
to
could
react.
highlight collide.
Molecules have to collide.
Okay. So that's part of the definition of collision theory, right? Is that the whole definition or no?
No.
All right. So I have part of the definition, but remember collision theory has three parts. I probably should have. Well, you can tell me in a second. Is there anything I can put in here for blue?
Below change. Well, you can explain why.
The Y.
Temperature.
So temperature I highlight, that's the
I
factor.
guess the temperature makes it happen. I guess that's what you highlight, but kind of.
But it doesn't really explain.
It doesn't
Just kinda like-
explain.
So my blue's pretty weak, is what you're telling me?
Yeah.
I need to show some blue?
So you'll see that Michelle is really defining the criteria with kids, and what's really popular with teachers is they color code the success criteria. But what you see in an earlier video is Michelle's really deconstructing the standards with the kids and making sure that the kids are clear about the expectations for the definition of collision theory, because this is so important to all future work that they're going to be doing in chemistry. Co-construction obviously expands student ownership when you get them involved. As you saw in the video clip, samples of work are essential in defining the criteria, and that means good quality samples of student work and non-examples like you saw Michelle use. So the criteria is only as powerful as the student work that lays alongside it. The student work adds the qualitative criteria to really communicate to the kids what's effective and what's high quality. Obviously, having kids compare examples and non-examples and talking about what makes one sample more effective than another, that's a great way to co-construct and define criteria with kids. Annotating exemplars with the success criteria, since Michelle had the success criteria color-coded, we could look at, the kids could analyze a lot of good examples and then annotate those examples with the color codes. We see a lot of teachers that add visuals to the rubric, so they might add an icon or a visual, a non-linguistic representation to kind of represent each criteria point, because the purpose in using the success criteria is we want to release it. We want the kids to not need it. So we engage them in really taking ownership of this success criteria, but in the end, we want them to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and not use it. And obviously we can scaffold the rubrics, we can add criteria to certain kids, we can take some criteria away to make it more manageable for kids. What you saw in the video is Michelle also starting to model the process. And she did this by making herself vulnerable and putting an example up on the board and having kids give her some feedback about what she could add to make her response high quality. So this modeling the formative process or the peer review process or self-assessment process is pretty integral to ensuring that kids can actually do it. We use a variety of different protocols with impact teams. This is a visual of the tag strategy, and we obviously co-construct all these feedback stems with the kids. So we'll, talk to kids and have them discuss what are all the different ways that you could let a friend know that they did well. And so here's some feedback stems that connect to that. We also brainstorm with students what are different questions. If you have questions regarding the student work, what would be some respectful ways that you could question your partner? And then we brainstorm with kids some different ways that they could give a partner suggestion. And with kids that are a little bit older, we want them to name the success criteria that the student needs to work on. But we also want them to give them a pointer or a strategy or a way to close the gap. So it's one thing to say, hey, you're missing this, but it lifts the level of the review when a student can actually give a pointer. Here's a strategy that you could use to kind of actually close the gap and nail the success criteria. There's some other classroom protocols that we mentioned in the book, the GLOW and the GROW strategy for lower grade kids that you saw the first graders use early on. And then we also use the ladder of feedback, a feedback strategy I'm taken from Project Zero. So when we model the process with kids, we actually have to model this self and peer assessment process. We have to think aloud while we're modeling the process of using the tag strategy with students. And so think aloud is crucial. Students need a lot of practice analyzing samples before we turn them loose on one another's work. It actually works better if the teacher used a controlled sample across the classroom, because then the teachers can give really good feedback on kids' ability to analyze the samples. We also want to make sure that we're using some sort of color coding system, or teachers might number the success criteria so we can talk about the success criteria fluently. Lots of teachers use a fishbowl strategy where they'll get a partnership that is really good at giving feedback to one another, and the class will watch that student partnership engage in the tag strategy or the ladder of feedback strategy, and then the teacher can lead discussion about what was effective about what that partnership has done. We have a lot of videos on the Corwin website and on the Core Collaborative YouTube page that have kids actually engaging in the peer review process. We have lots of teacher teams that actually show those videos to their classes, and then they analyze the video of kids engaging in the peer review process about what makes that effective. So in closing, it's just really important that you model the self and peer assessment process with kids. Lots of teachers will do this. You'll bring an instructional coach and a teacher can role play the peer review process, but we can't say this enough how important it is that you model the process a lot so kids not only know the expectation of the peer review process, but they also know the expectation of actually the product or performance that they're learning about. So I'm going to toss this over to Barb for the next phase of the self and peer assessment process.
So we can't emphasize enough the notion that we must model and practice, helping kids learn to self and peer assess, to use success criteria to evaluate their own work and others. And a lot of our impact team models typically choose an area that they want to strengthen, and it often is in this area, the self and peer assessment, and they spend a year delving deep into how best to help teach students learn to self and use criteria to self and peer assess. And what's interesting is you think that if you model, teams often say, gee, if we model this and they practice a little bit, then they're going to be able to do it. But remember that students have been receptacles of our feedback for all of their educational career. They're waiting for us to tell them where they are and where to go next. So this is a new skill that they need to improve on, and it takes a ton of modeling and a ton of practice. The third thing it takes is the feedback on feedback, and this is where we ensure that we raise the quality of feedback in the classroom. Graham Nuttall in 2007 published a book, amazing research about the feedback in a classroom, and what he found was very interesting, that 80% of feedback in a classroom comes from students, and 80% is incorrect. So with that bit of research, we have to take a look and say feedback can double the rate of learning, but only if it's quality, if it's descriptive, if it moves the learner. So feedback on feedback is that third critical step in the student-centered assessment process that ensures that the feedback is accurate and descriptive. And feedback on feedback is just exactly that. There's modeling, and then the students practice using a student protocol, like one Paul just showed you, that tag protocol. And then the teacher moves around and takes a look at ways in which they can check the quality and the accuracy, basically, of the feedback. So you're giving feedback on the feedback to raise the quality and basically the effectiveness of the feedback. Now, teachers do this regularly and pretty casually. What we're suggesting to you is that this is not a casual practice. This is a very intentional and deliberate practice to ensure that the feedback is accurate and can be used. So we've talked to you about a couple of protocols. Paul showed you TAG. We talked about the ladder of feedback. We've also talked about grow and glow. So the video you're going to see next is James Milkert at Lyons Township High School in Chicago. He's a world history teacher. This is a 9th grade class, and he's actually using feedback on feedback to help the kids improve the quality of their feedback in a peer review process.
So would you please don't start anything, don't do anything, please, other than just give your writing to a partner that you've been giving feedback to. 3 minutes. All I would like you to do is make your partner's work look like the paragraph on the screen. Highlight the evidence in one color. Highlight the analysis at the bottom of the paragraph in a different one. Circle or make a note of where the verb is. Okay, you've done a great job. You have enough to work with wherever you're at. With that highlighted work on one side of your desk, would you put your worksheet that says ladder of feedback on the other side, please? On the top for topic, please put ancient Mesopotamia. You can abbreviate. Can you put your eyes on the board, please, for just a minute? You want your partner to be a rock star. You want them to do the things on the board. So when you are writing comments on our feedback sheet, please do your best to make them specific to the criteria on the board. What can they do with their evidence? Is it accurate? Is there enough? Is it specific? Is it credible? What can they do with their analysis? Remember, we're trying to prove what in our writing? Not that it's a civilization, but that it's a what? Civilized or uncivilized place. which means in your analysis that you read, the author, your partner, should tell you what civilized looks like and how that evidence compares to that. It should come back to that idea, civilized or uncivilized. And if it doesn't, that's a great thing you could give feedback about. I want you to try to write one thing in each box. Okay. It's okay if you go rogue and it's not from here. It's okay if it's just a comment, because when we're done with this, you're going to have a chance to talk to your partner. So let's put another 3 minutes on the clock. They allowed ancient Mesopotamia to become a safer place. Let's go with what you've got. You each get 2 minutes. Start with something positive, and then share what you think they could do. And listen. And if you want to explain why you did what you did, I bet you'll come to an even better conclusion about what you should do moving forward. What'd you say you liked?
I liked how she used specific evidence. It sounded like she knew what I was talking about.
When?
In both of them, actually.
With what part?
Well, when she was talking,
It's a compliment. Yeah?
she included everything that they traded. And
Oh, that is good. That's very good. What did you know?
I think I meant economy because I switched the first paragraph last night and I switched what I was talking about and I looked back and I was confused, so I was like, oh, better switch it.
So that's smart reflection. That's okay. Easy fix.
yeah.
Does she tell you what civilized looks like in her mind and how this fits that?
That was one thing I think focusing on.
Awesome. Very good.
Okay. So when you take a look at that and you think that, oh my God, how can, especially at the secondary level, how do I have time to do all that? Well, we can do it in a variety of ways, and it doesn't have to be 100%. It's a practice and a skill that develops over time to ensure quality and reliability. You could do it like James did it, through conferencing. There's also digital platforms we use a lot. Google Shared Drive, Google Docs. Sown to Grow is a platform, a digital platform that we use that supports the formative assessment process. Video, but the point is we constantly have to monitor the quality of feedback to improve it, to ensure that it's accurate and it's descriptive, and it moves the learning forward.
That moves us to the next, the last phase, and good news, we have just a few minutes left. And that's really the goal setting phase, is that we have to engage students to do something with the feedback that they're getting from their self and peer assessments. And this usually is some sort of goal setting where the kids are setting a goal for what criteria they need to work on. And then the teacher or students are giving strategies to one another on how to fill the gap. So we're going to dig in to really look at James again modeling the goal setting process with his kids, because just like the peer review process needs to be modeled, we also have to model how to set really good goals with kids, because that's not something that they come into the classroom being able to do.
I can write a goal for myself. I can focus my efforts. It's not the best goal. Why? It's not a SMART goal because it's not specific. Yeah, I don't even know how to measure that because it's so vague, it's so general. So what if I wrote something like this based on your feedback to me? Then I know what I'm doing. It's bold, is that what you said? I dream big. I dream big. Right? Or maybe I could do this. And maybe if I have content issues, evidence issues, and analysis issues, I'm just going to pick one. And I'm going to be better at that part. And it's okay if the other part is still not your best. I don't want to take on so much that I'm not going to be able to do any of it. Are you thinking? What are you gonna write?
I'm going to be more specific about what was fair about Palmer on these codes.
Okay, great. Is fairness important for you in a civilized place? Okay, and so it sounds like you want to make that more clear, why fairness in the code made it civilized. Okay, great. I like that a lot. What are we going to do? What's our goal?
So we'll move on to wrapping this up. So this last portion is really thinking through the goal setting piece. So goal setting must be modeled by the teacher. The teacher really has to explain and model, what good goal setting looks like. There's a lot of different ways to do it, like video, so we can show videos of kids engaged in the goal setting process, fish bowling like we did with the peer review process. All of these things really work to build kids' capacity around the goal setting process. Revision, if we're going to give feedback to kids, there's an expectation that they're going to revise. Quality goals, really it's about like naming the strengths of the learner, what next steps, and those next steps are aligned to the success criteria. And for our older learners, it's really also, there's an expectation that they're giving their friends a strategy, how might you close the gap, and that these goals have to be monitored. So we typically work on building some buffer time in the curriculum where we're really working with students on setting goals and monitoring their goals. So if kids don't tend to, meet their goals, that they're going to learn through the mistakes that they made. And like I said earlier, revision is always required. So Barb's going to summarize the 4-stage process.
Talking about strengthening their skills as readers. We saw them very independent. They weren't dependent on a teacher for say, now you need to do this, now you need to do that. They owned their learning. And so when we talked about, when we had you do the T-chart, said what are the strengths and what are the inferences, what did the teacher have to do to create the conditions where students were empowered by their own ability to take success criteria and move forward? So we talked about those 4 stages. They first have to define the criteria, teacher clarity, that roadmap to learning, and co-construct that criteria with the kids. So it's just not a rubric that you hand to the kids. They understand the roadmap. They may not be there, but they know what it takes to get there. Modeling, we cannot emphasize enough how much we need to model and model some more. The process of using success criteria to analyze, to determine where you need to move next. And modeling in a variety of different settings with think alouds, with examples and non-examples, and allow the kids to practice. And then, of course, some feedback on feedback is ensuring that the quality of feedback that the students give and receive is descriptive, is beneficial, moves them in their own learning. And then finally, setting relevant and very specific goals that are achievable, but also challenge the student. So the impact team model basically has one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to strengthen our practices around student ownership of learning. And that's what we do. That's why we meet. That's what our protocols are about, because it's about building student efficacy, that belief in themselves as a learner. They know how to learn. They believe in themselves as a learner. And that's what we do in impact teams, is develop the conditions so student-centered assessment thrives in our classrooms.
So we're going to close out the webinar by really laying out a call to action for you and your teams. And we have started a challenge over the summer called the Impact Team Challenge, and there's 6 steps to success. And this is in the Canvas course, and there's I saw a lot of discussions popping up regarding, will we have access to the video? I know that this video from the webinar will be on the Corwin website, so you'll be able to see all the videos. And there's a lot of other resources in the Canvas learning management system. But we have the 6 steps to success. That the first step is we have to develop real good transferable tasks that transfer across units that are criteria-based. We have to create a lot of models of success using exemplars and lots of samples of student papers to actually clarify the success criteria. kids need a lot of practice with actually developing these products performances collaboratively and independently. Then we expand the peer review process with one of the strategies that you saw during today's webinar, whether it be the tag strategy, glow and grow, or the ladder of feedback. Teams then bring this work to the table along with the goals that kids set and the self and peer assessments that kids are engaged in doing, and we analyze that evidence to discuss finally our collective actions. So we're really hoping that you'll take the Impact Team Challenge. There's more information in the Canvas course, and we'll go into that towards the end here. I know I wanted to open up for questions. It looks like we're turning it straight over to Charlene.
Yeah, hi. I have a question that came in. Would you like it?
Sure.
Yeah, bring it on.
Terrific. Can I implement this process in my class, even though it is not being implemented across our district, or does this need to be a district initiative?
No, absolutely. This is the formative assessment process, essentially, where it's a partnership with students. And you can do it in your class, with your team, with a partner. But it's basically ensuring that students develop ownership of learning. And of course, we have teachers and teams and partners and at all levels do this. If you take a look at our book, it's pretty much our book is more of a kind of a large handbook, and it kind of takes you through step by step how to develop this process in your classroom.
Terrific. I have one last question. Do you need to pair students of similar abilities for the impact team model to work best?
It works in all different kinds of ways, and so teacher teams and teachers are pretty relentless in trying to figure out the different partnerships that occur in the classroom, but we've seen it work really well where the partners are more on the same level, and depending on the relationship that students have, we've seen really good partnerships where kids are across the level. So I think it's really trial and error and trying to figure out what partnerships work best. But what we're really driving for is respectful conversations about how to give and receive feedback to the kids in our in their classrooms.
Terrific. Thank you. That's all the questions we have. We can turn it over to Charlene now.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, Paul and Barb, for all the wonderful resources and videos that you shared. If you'd like to learn more about the Impact Teams model, you can check out Paul and Barb's book, Leading Impact Teams. As a thank you for attending this webinar, we are offering a 20% off promo code, which you can see on the screen right there. We'll share this promo code in the follow-up email after the webinar as well. For assistance in implementing impact teams in your school or district, you can work with Paul or Barb or a certified impact teams consultant to help your teachers use their evidence to analyze student work and make an impact on student achievement. You can learn more at www.corin.com/impactteams. You can also catch Paul and Dave Nagel and David Horton at the upcoming Impact Teams Teacher Clarity Institute this March in Nashville, Tennessee. For more information, you can visit us at www.corin.com/Nashville2018. And that concludes this season of the Monday afternoon webinar series. We will be announcing our spring season shortly, so please keep your eye out for that. And we are very excited to have Diane Sweeney, John Hattie, Eddie Moore, Tonya Ward-Singer, and several other current authors join us in the spring. So you can see the full lineup at www.corin.com/webinars. We will be listing the new schedule in the coming weeks. Thank you once again to Paul and Barb for joining us, and thank you for joining us this Monday for our webinar. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.